Well, good afternoon, everyone. I hope you're doing well. Our second restoration lecture here remotely, and I don't know, I've been inside for the last pretty much 2 days. It's been raining hard here in Asheville, but today the sun's coming out, so I'm hoping to get outside and enjoy the weather just a little bit. I hope wherever you are, you're having a chance to enjoy yourselves a little bit here and there as well, and adapting to our new normal through the rest of the semester. It's been announced from the university, you've probably heard. So we're going to keep rolling with this through May. So you may have heard, we may have some potential positive environmental effects of the COVID-19 pandemic. This is related to air quality. These are data that were gathered in Belgium. And it's comparing nitrates concentrations in the atmosphere for some different times through history, but especially interesting if you look at data from the beginning to late February 2020 this year during the lockdown in China, and compare that to the year before. You see a lot less of those high nitrate high NO2 observations. So a lot less air pollution going on. And I think this is relevant to our class because it just reinforces the point that I've seen over and over again, which is that if we can remove human stressors to the environment can recover pretty quickly in a lot of cases. So today we're going to be talking about wetlands. We've finished up streams and moving into a different kind of aquatic habitat, really a transition between an aquatic and a terrestrial habitat. But these are similar to streams in a couple respects, a big part of which has to do with their legal importance, and we'll talk about that. So we're going to be just getting through the first question today, maybe talk just a little bit about the second, but this is our outline for how we're going to cover wetlands. So what is a wetland? Some of you may have had a chance to take the course here at UNC on wetlands, and I encourage you to do so if you haven't already. But we can define them a few different ways. So as scientists, we talk about this being a transitional habitat, what you might call an ecotone. That's E-C-O-T-O-N-E. That just refers to a transitional habitat between different habitat types. So wetlands being transitional between terrestrial and aquatic. Now, the legal definition is important because just like streams, wetlands are subject to a regulation under the Clean Water Act. So to decide what habitats fall under the Clean Water Act and what don't, there are some pretty specific legal definitions about what is a wetland, and we'll get into those here in just a moment. So you'll hear the term jurisdictional wetland, and so that just means it's a wetland that is protected under the Clean Water Act. So any kind of construction or development work that goes on in a jurisdictional wetland is subject to a whole other slew of permitting. And so a lot of our students have actually gone on, several of my students, and in their careers they've been involved in the process of wetland delineation. This is something that environmental consulting firms do. This is something that a lot of engineering firms will do in-house. They'll have environmental consultants that work for them. So this is really one of those transferable skills, a marketable skill, and it's something that it's good to be familiar with. And if you take our wetlands class, you'll definitely gain those skills. But we're just going to give an overview of how that happens today. So the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service lists 3 criteria for something to be a wetland: the presence of hydrophytes, presence of hydric soil, and then a saturated or inundated substrate. So what are hydrophytes? We can break that word down into its roots for sure, right? So hydro referring to water, phyte referring to plants. So these are the water-loving plants. So any plants that are adapted to living in water we can call hydrophytes, but we can break those down into obligate and facultative hydrophytes. So obligate hydrophytes are those plants that have to have water. They can't live without it. They're obligated to have water, if you will. So that's when they're found over 99% of the time in water. Facultative hydrophytes are those that can live in water but don't have to. So just to look at that numerically, if they're found in water more than 2/3 of the time, then they're considered facultative hydrophytes. So because these are involved in the legal definition of wetlands, there are legal definitions of what are hydrophytes as well. So the Environmental Protection Agency has a list of 6,000 of these plants that are used to delineate wetlands across the U.S. And the North Carolina Division of Environmental Quality has a list of 128, at least last I checked, for North Carolina. So you've seen some of these species around, so I thought I'd just show you a couple of them that we see around here in western North Carolina. And so these are obligate species. The black willow, we have some willow down on Glens Creek on our campus. They're all different kinds of plants, right? So some shrubs as well, things like the swamp rose, the genus Rosa. They're herbs as well, right? So the common cattail in the genus Typha is also a wetland plant that you're probably familiar with. And then in the large categories of grasses, sedges, and rushes, there's lots of these, but bulrushes have those particular stems. These are in the genus Scirpus. So these are some plants that you've probably seen if you've spent much time around the water, which I hope you all have. All right, so those are our hydrophytes. So what does it mean to have hydric soils? Those of you that have taken soils could answer this question. And so based on the definition, it's soil that is saturated with water. And that can be permanently or it can be seasonally, right? As water tables rise and fall with the seasons. Some soils might be saturated with water sometimes, but not all the time. So how do we characterize soils, right? How could you go out to an area and answer the question, are these hydric soils? So hydric soils are dominated by anaerobic conditions. When they're saturated with water, oxygen is not able to circulate as well, and so you don't have the oxidation reactions happening that you would normally have in soil that isn't saturated. And again, we get into legal definitions here, right? Because this is something that we have to be able to say legally whether it's a hydric soil or not. And so federal law actually uses vegetation as an indicator of hydric soil. So soil that in its undrained condition, right? So we'll talk later on about how we've modified wetlands, but in its undrained condition, is it flooded or ponded with water long enough during a growing season to develop an anaerobic condition that supports the growth and regeneration of hydrophytic vegetation? So are they able to grow and regenerate? This can be tricky to define if soil has been drained. So it's only after you reconnect the natural hydrology that you can evaluate this, really. And the National Technical Committee of Hydric Soils, they define it as soil that's submerged long enough to develop anaerobic conditions in the upper part. And so when we look at soils, when we take an auger or soil probe or have some other way of looking into the soil, we can actually look at some visual characteristics of soil and see whether there are anaerobic conditions in the upper part, right? So near the surface. So when we find anaerobic conditions in soil, it's characterized by a dark surface layer. So that dark surface layer is composed of organic matter that hasn't decomposed. Now that red, orangish, brown color that we often associate with soil, that is oxidated iron, right? If you think of rust, right, it has that reddish look to it. So you have to have the presence of a lot of oxygen to get those reddish brown colors. So when you don't have that, you have darker coloration. So the soil on the right, you can see has a lot of organic matter accumulated there in the top. And one of the legal indicators is that this should go down 10 centimeters. And so you can see the 10 centimeter measure there. And so there's definitely dark organic matter in the soil on the right there that hasn't decomposed. And partly hasn't decomposed because of a lack of access to oxygen, which a lot of the decomposing microbes and other organisms work best under. Okay, so what are the steps that go into delineating a wetland? So the first thing you're going to need to do is examine the plant community and literally break it down into the percent cover of hydrophytic vegetation. You're going to locate topographical breaks, right? Because those changes in elevation are going to determine how water flows. And so what'll happen is, you'll be standing inside a wetland at one point, and then as you move up in elevation, you'll come out of that wetland, and that will help you define and look for where those transitions in the plant community happen. Then you'll do a soil sample, and again, looking at soil color to determine whether it's hydric or not. The depth to the water table is important, but can fluctuate. And then soil texture as well can vary between wetlands and upland areas. Then if you were doing this, you'd enter the points where you had done your soil samples and examined the plant community into a GIS database. And then based on that and the topographical breaks, you'd go ahead and GIS software, create a file that delineates that. And then you'd send that to whatever regulatory agency has jurisdiction over that wetland, generally the state, but of course if there were federal properties involved, it would be at the national level. So there are a couple kind of neat videos that show how to do this, and I'm going to link these in the description of the video below, because there's not really a quick and easy way for me to show that video in here. I think you have to click on it, and then I have to wait until the video would be over to advance the slide. So just take a look at those videos and the description underneath this one. The first one looks at breaking down wetland versus upland species as they're talked about. Think hydrophytes versus non-hydrophytes. And then the second video, which I went right over, looks at how you would take a soil sample as well. So when we look at wetlands in our state, not surprisingly, wetlands are a little sparse the further you get from the ocean. And so up in the mountains, we don't have all that many wetlands. In fact, if you look at the French Broad watershed there to the far left, there's not much of anything at all, right? So these green areas are wetlands. So these are something that you find more at lower elevations, more gently sloping topography. It's interesting though, wetlands, just like forests or grasslands, can be divided up based on their successional stage. Of course, successional, right? We think disturbance, non-equilibrium communities, right? And so what we might think of as more R-selected species that have shorter life cycles, lots of propagules, poor competitors, but they are good at getting to open habitats. Those are the kind of wetland plants that we'd see in early successional communities. So this is a cattail and bulrush dominated community down on the coast. And the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service recognizes 28 different kinds of wetlands. And so when we go about restoring these wetlands, it's important to figure out which of these categories, or subclasses as they call them, apply. So when we find our reference, then that's what we're going to try to match it up to. On the other extreme, we could have an old growth wetland that's comprised of some pretty big trees, right? So the big resource here is light, and so the larger our plants are, the better competitors are going to be, the later successional species they'll be. So this is a bald cypress wetland, and so this is an example of something that has taken decades to get established from a community perspective. Okay, so the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers and the U.S. EPA since the 1970s have adopted this definition. Wetlands are areas that are inundated or saturated by surface or groundwater at a frequency and duration sufficient to support, and that under normal circumstances do support, a prevalence of vegetation typically adapted for life in saturated soil conditions. Wetlands generally include swamps, marshes, bogs, and similar areas. So if the term indicator species is popping into your head now, well, that's a good thing. So the idea is that vegetation is what's used. That's great because we don't have to monitor as many variables, but it could be problematic because if you imagine that we're trying to restore an area and we want to know is it a wetland and what kind of a wetland? Well, we might be working in an area that's been drained and had soil brought in and changed. So the first thing we'll have to do is get back to normal circumstances, reconnect the hydrology, and then see what kind of vegetation shows up. So it can take a while using this definition to actually say that something is a wetland. Some of you may have been to the Pink Beds Trail near the Cradle of Forestry. This is a rare example of a mountain wetland, and it's a pretty cool hike. It's a really cool hike. So we're in near the headwaters of the Mills River here. One thing we'll get into in the next lecture, but I'll just touch upon now, is that we have this analogy of the water that drains off of a watershed as sort of like the water that comes out of our body as well, right? And that represents kind of the health of our body. And so if you want to think of the water in these rivers and streams as sort of like the urine from the human analogy, well then really the wetlands are like the kidneys, because the wetlands are what the water is going to flow through and percolate through before it gets into that main channel of the river. And so that slow flowing water across all these plants is going to allow a lot of nutrients to be taken up. It's going to allow a lot of sediment to settle out. So the pink beds are a really great example of how that water would naturally have been filtered before it gets into the main stems of our mountain mountain rivers and streams. So we'll touch more on this idea of the ecological importance of wetlands in the next lecture, but it's something to keep in mind if you ever have a chance to hike along these wetlands, to think of all the important ecosystem processes that are going on. So that's going to wrap up this lecture. It's a little bit shorter one, but do go and watch those videos. There's about 11 minutes worth of videos that will show you how this wetlands delineation process actually works. As always, leave me comments below the video, any suggestions or comments or ideas that you have. Feel free to reach out to me as well through other forum. And just a reminder that we do have our Google Hangouts, our weekly non-mandatory Google Hangouts happening today at our regular class time. So I really hope to see some of y'all there, check in with y'all, see how you're doing. You can bring questions from our class, or we can just kind of compare notes, how we've been passing time and what we've been up to as we practice social isolation, or social distancing, so to say. All right, cool. So hope you guys are well, and I'll talk to you soon. Take care.